Welcome, learners, to another deep dive. Today we're plunging headfirst into, well, a whirlwind of recent headlines, really. There's a major international trade announcement that seems to have everyone talking. And you know us, we love getting into stories with surprising facts and layers of detail. This one definitely fits the bill. We're looking at the recent declaration by former U.S. President Donald Trump about a massive trade deal with Japan. It's an announcement that's made a lot of noise, claims of huge investments, job creation. It's big stuff.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here isn't just the announcement itself, it's how it's being reported, and maybe even more how it's being received. Our sources today are pretty varied. We've got official news from places like the Times of India, CBS News, then there's deeper analysis from the Congressional Research Service, the USDA, even legal takes from firms like Mayer Brown. And, we're also looking at the candid commentary, sometimes pretty pointed stuff, directly from the public on places like Reddit.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack all of that for you. We'll break down the terms that were announced. We'll explore the reactions from the official lines to, the public skepticism. And we'll try to put it in context, comparing it to previous trade agreements, too, the goal. Just to give you the full picture so you can see what's really being said and what questions are still hanging out there. Okay, let's dig in. So July 22nd, 2025, former President Trump announces this massive trade agreement with Japan is done. And this came right after a threat, remember? A 25% tariff on Japanese goods if a deal wasn't reached by August 1st. So there was pressure.
Definitely setting a deadline there.
So what did he actually say was in it? Key elements. First, a 15% American tariff on Japanese imports. Now, that's lower than the 25% threatened, but still.
It's significant, yeah.
Second, and this is the one that really jumped out, a claim of a $550 billion Japanese investment into the U.S. And the really striking part of that claim, he asserted the U.S. would get 90% of the profits from this investment.
90%, that's quite a specific and unusual figure in trade terms.
Right. And he also said this investment would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Big promises.
And to put this in context, this wasn't really out of the blue in terms of strategy. Our sources suggest it's part of what's been called a last-minute trade deal blitz by the former president. Just before this, we saw similar announcements, deals with the Philippines, Indonesia, both facing 19% tariffs.
Okay. So there's a pattern.
Exactly. The stated strategy behind it, as we see in the sources, is consistent. Revive U.S. manufacturing, correct unfair trade practices. Things often framed as hurting American industry, and also bring in additional government revenue. It's a clear focus on domestic interest, using negotiation, and, tariff threats as leverage.
Okay, but here's where it gets, really interesting. Despite these big pronouncements, this new deal, it's been met with a lot of skepticism, even outright disbelief from different places.
Yeah, the narrative starts to get complicated pretty quickly. Let's start with that 90% of profits claim. Wow. Our sources show this is widely questioned. Some commentators just flat out called it a bullshit metric Trump invented or pure fantasy.
Why so much skepticism on that specific point?
Well, the fundamental issue really is how international trade actually works. It's mostly private companies dealing with other private companies, right? They make things, sell things, generate profits based on their business. So it's just unclear how a government entity could possibly direct where 90% of private profits go. It seems to misunderstand, maybe deliberately, the basic mechanics.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's Japan's reaction. What do they say? Immediately after the announcement, Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba said he needs to examine details of U.S. trade deal.
Not exactly jumping for joy or confirming everything, then?
Not at all. And you saw comments online, like on Reddit, asking, does Japan know this?
Right. Or Japan's probably reading this at the same time. We're like, wait, we did what now?
Exactly. It highlights this disconnect, or at least a lack of clear public agreement from the other side on the announced terms.
Yeah.
Suggests it might have been a bit unilateral in the announcement.
Which brings us to the feasibility question. That huge $550 billion investment and the hundreds of thousands of jobs. Critics are pointing out that an investment that big, especially in manufacturing, that takes decades to actually happen.
Right. Building plants, supply chains.
Yeah.
It's not overnight.
And they also bring up modern manufacturing. It's heavily automated with robots now. So these new plants, they won't generate many jobs in the way they used to. How do you get hundreds of thousands of jobs from that?
That's the question. And people are drawing comparisons to past promises that didn't quite pan out, like the Foxconn thing in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Big jobs pledge didn't happen as claimed.
Yeah, I remember that. So there's history there feeding the skepticism. One user even said the $550 billion is promised but will never be made. It's just some noise around the 15% tariff rate.
Ouch. Yeah, that sums up the cynicism pretty well. And speaking of the tariffs, okay, 15% is lower than the 25% threat. We get that. But it's still a huge jump from the average U.S. tariff rate in 2023, which was around 2.5%.
Wow. 2.5% average to 15%. That's a big difference.
It really is. And economists consistently warn about this stuff. Tariffs like these can lead to higher inflation and lower economic growth. The mechanism is pretty simple, really.
Yeah.
Companies facing the tariffs, they usually pass those costs down.
Down to consumers?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it effectively becomes a kind of stealth goods tax on Americans. We saw one comment from someone working at a Japanese medical company. They said their company already factored in a 10% cost increase, their COGS, cost of goods sold.
Okay.
And now they're adding another 5%. And they added, all of this passed down to our customer base that can't afford it in the first place. So real world impact right there.
Okay. What about the other side of the coin? The supposed wins for the U.S., like more market access in Japan for cars and rice.
That sounds good on paper, definitely.
Yeah.
A potential boost for American producers. But skeptics point to the realities on the ground in Japan. Regulations there, their own super efficient auto industry.
They make good cars.
They do. And consumer tastes, Preferences for smaller cars, specific types of rice. It might be really hard for U.S. products to gain much ground, even if the tariffs change slightly.
So just opening the door doesn't mean everyone walks through it.
Precisely. Like one comment suggested, for rice, unless U.S. agriculture agrees to farm rice breeds to Japanese requirements, it won't change much. Imports would likely still be focused on domestic and Asian sources. It hints that maybe this market access part is, as one critic put it, a generic nothing burger with no hard agreements. Looks good, maybe, but lacks real substance.
Okay, so to really grasp this, maybe we need to look back a bit. This isn't the first U.S.-Japan trade deal recently, is it?
No, absolutely not. We need to talk about the Stage 1 deal, the U.S.-Japan Trade Agreement, or USJTA. That came into force January 1st, 2020. There was a separate digital trade agreement alongside it, too.
And how did that one compare? Was it massive?
Well, no, not really. It was actually quite limited in scope. It only covered about 5% of U.S. goods imports from Japan, and maybe 18% of Japan's goods imports from the U.S. It mainly focused on tariff cuts for specific things, mostly agriculture like beef and pork and some industrial goods.
Why those specific things?
The main goal seemed to be helping U.S. farmers get back market share they lost when the U.S. pulled out of the PPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, back in 2017.
Okay, so it was trying to fix a problem created by leaving that bigger deal.
Pretty much. Like for U.S. beef, the USJTA aimed to get tariffs down to match competitors from the CPTTP, which is the successor to TPP, and the EU, dropping from like 38.5% down to 9% eventually by 2033.
So targeted relief for certain sectors?
Exactly, which highlights how things often start small, targeting specific areas.
But what's really telling, I think, is what was left out of that 2020 deal.
Yes, absolutely crucial. It did not cut Japanese tariffs on things like U.S. butter, skim milk powder.
Dairy.
Right. And crucially, no rice.
Still no rice.
And on the U.S. side, it did not touch U.S. tariffs on cars imported from Japan. Autos were left for further negotiations.
So the biggest, most sensitive stuff just wasn't included in Stage 1?
Correct. It was far from a comprehensive deal. And here's another interesting wrinkle from that 2020 deal. The safeguards. Even for things in the deal, like beef, there was a safeguard level set 242,000 metric tons. If U.S. beef exports went over that, tariffs would snap back up.
Right, a safety valve for Japan.
Right. But here's the kicker. U.S. beef exports to Japan in 2018, before the deal even started.
Yeah.
They were already at 401,653 metric tons, almost double the safeguard level.
Wait, really? So the safeguard was set below existing trade levels?
Essentially, yes. Which means the deal, while maybe lowering the base tariff, might not have actually allowed for much growth in exports before triggering higher tariffs again. It tempers how much of a boost it really was.
That's a fascinating detail. It shows how
Yeah.
complex these things are.
Definitely. And one more point on that 2020 deal. It didn't need Congress's approval in the U.S.
How did that work?
Used something called Delegated Tariff Proclamation Authorities, basically executive power. The president couldn't act it without a vote in Congress.
Which is different from how major trade deals usually happen, right?
Very different. Big comprehensive deals usually go through a whole legislative process, debate, ratification. This was faster, but perhaps, less anchored in broad consensus.
Okay, so pulling all this together, the new announcement, the skepticism, the history with stage one, what's the bigger picture here for U.S.-Japan trade and maybe global trade generally?
Well, zooming out, this deal blitz strategy using tariff threats, it clearly gets attention. It forces countries to the negotiating table, you could argue.
So it works, in a way.
It achieves that.
Yeah.
But it sparks a huge debate, right? Is this actually an effective way to get good, sustainable trade outcomes for everyone involved, especially U.S. businesses and consumers? Or does it just undermine the established global trade rules? Does it create uncertainty, risk retaliation, strain relationships?
Like with Japan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Japanese officials have basically said these U.S. tariff actions could hurt the overall relationship, maybe even discourage Japanese companies from investing in the U.S. down the line.
Yeah.
It's a high-stakes game. And, we have to mention this other perspective that came up a lot, especially on places like Reddit. Some people see this whole massive deal announcement as a classic distraction play. Meaning they suggest it's designed to shift the news cycle, pull attention away from other, maybe more difficult political issues happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Like the Epstein files that was mentioned explicitly by users. Feels like he's dropping made-up mega deals just to shift the spotlight off Epstein. It's a cynical take, for sure, but it's out there and reflects a certain distrust.
Okay. And one thing that really strikes me is this idea of unfinished business. The 2020 deal was called Stage 1. Autos, services, the big stuff was supposed to come later. But it hasn't really, has it?
No, those broader talks seem to have stalled or just never got serious traction.
Plus, you mentioned these agreements lack a formal way to settle disputes. They just rely on consultation.
That's right. No formal dispute settlement mechanism.
Why is that a big deal?
Well, think of it like a contract without an agreed-upon judge or arbitration process if things go wrong. Formal mechanisms, like in the WTO or older deals like NAFTA, provide a clear, often legally binding way to resolve disagreements. Without it, enforcement is weaker. It relies more on just goodwill and ongoing negotiation between the governments.
Which can be less predictable.
Much less predictable and potentially less effective if one side feels the other isn't holding up their end. Which leads back to that core question. Will these terms announced by the former president actually turn into real jobs, real investment benefits, especially if Japan hasn't formally, publicly signed on or ratified them through their own processes?
The skepticism seems pretty grounded then, given the history and the mechanics.
It seems grounded in the lack of confirmed details, the unusual nature of some claims like the profit sharing, Japan's cautious reaction, and the track record of Stage 1 having limitations.
Wow. Okay, what a deep dive. We've really peeled back the layers here. Bold claims, lots of skepticism, and a really fascinating look at how these international economic deals get made, or at least announced.
Yeah, it really highlights that tension, doesn't it, between the big political announcements and the often messy, complicated reality of global commerce. It reminds us that trade deals are rarely simple. They build on the past, they deviate, they always have this mix of hoped-for benefits and potential downsides.
So the big question for us, as people trying to stay informed, how do we tell the difference between credible economic promises and, well, political spin? Especially when the details are fuzzy or not confirmed by everyone involved. How much should we focus on the mechanics, the feasibility, versus just the stated goals of these big agreements?
That's the critical question, isn't it? It really speaks to needing that deeper understanding, looking beyond the headlines.
Definitely something to keep in mind as these global economic stories keep developing. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.